Right now, 4 women who are suing the state of Idaho after they were denied abortions are getting their day in court. All of them unable to access care following severe pregnancy complications in a state with a near total abortion ban. And they are sharing their very emotional stories.
There were issues with the fetal stomach, with multiple issues with the fetal heart, basically every major organ system was involved. And my understanding was the severity of all of those issues led to very poor outcomes, that the pregnancy was likely not going to make it to term, but if it did, would definitely lead to a baby that had no chance of survival. At the time of that scan, we were given, all of those diagnoses, and I knew that remaining pregnant was inherently more risky than not being pregnant.
Every successful abortion results in the death of an unborn child. Every one of them. Idaho has a right to protect these precious lives.
Well, in Idaho, nearly 1 in 4 OBGYNs have either quit or retired. That's according to a report by an Idaho physicians group. Joining us now, law professor and author of Dollars for Life, the Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment, Mary Ziegler. Also with me, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin and Democratic strategist Julie Roginski. Lisa, you were saying that before you came down here, you were watching this. One of the attorneys representing these plaintiffs said they are not trying to tell Idaho how to write its laws, but that the laws as they are written are not working. Explain what we're seeing here.
What we're seeing here, Chris, isn't a challenge to Idaho's very strict abortion restrictions. What we're seeing is the Center for Reproductive Rights, on behalf of each of these 4 women who have experienced denial of abortion care in Idaho, had to go out of state to find a termination of their pregnancy. They are basically saying you need to clarify for Idaho's women when they qualify for an emergency abortion. If you're going to have a law that allows women to access abortion care in an emergency, what does that emergency look like? Because each of the 4 of us presented in situations where not only was the baby not going to survive, but had we carried the child to term, our health was threatened too. Wasn't that an emergency? Please provide some guidance.
Mary, the Texas Supreme Court ruled against the plaintiffs in a similar case last year. The fact, though, that we have a trial here, I wonder what does that tell us about the state of the fight now and, of course, the state of the fight moving forward. We, of course, saw in 7 of the 10 states where abortion was on the ballot just last week, reproductive rights were affirmed, but the fight apparently isn't over in states where there are these serious challenges to women's health and access.
Yeah, I think that it wouldn't surprise me to see a similar outcome in this case. The Idaho Supreme Court has been very conservative on this matter, has been pretty resistant to any challenge to the state's abortion ban. So a ruling like the one we saw in Texas, where essentially they say doctors can just use reasonable judgment to make these kinds of calls, there's nothing confusing about this law, may be forthcoming. That isn't going to change the fact that the more we hear about this kind of case, the more resistant a lot of voters are going to be to abortion bans. But to your point, Chris, ballot initiatives aren't going to be a perfect solution. They may be in places like Idaho, which does have voter-initiated processes, but in a lot of other states like Texas, that option isn't on the table, which means that whatever happens in this case and whatever happens with future ballot initiatives, the fight really will continue.
I wonder, Julie, are the legal battles like these an opening for Democrats, or what should Democrats be thinking about now? It's clear that their hopes for abortion as an issue overall, it's not transferable necessarily, say, to a presidential candidate in the case of Kamala Harris, but it is something that the party as a whole believes in overwhelmingly, and in fact, so do a majority of Republicans.
Yes, and I think this is something that they need to communicate to women. Look, there's not one woman on earth who's a mother or who wanted to be a mother who has not gone through something brutal in the sense that even if you had a successful pregnancy, you're constantly worried about it. I mean, I was pregnant. I was worried about it. I'll tell you a personal story I've never told. When I was 3 months I went to the hospital because I thought I was having a miscarriage here in New York. And the one thing I have to say that I never worried about is that the doctors treating me were going to not do their jobs. I knew right away that whatever was going to happen, the doctors would be able to take care of me. And luckily, that pregnancy survived, and I have a very healthy son. But that's something that people in large parts of the country can't count on anymore. I mean, it's brutal. They literally don't know whether they're going to be able to rely on doctors to take care of them, to take care of their pregnancy, and to take care of whatever happens to their baby, if the baby survives or not. And that's something that I think, it doesn't matter what your party affiliation is, that is just something every woman out there who's ever been pregnant or wanted to be pregnant understands and appreciates. It's just a horror situation.
I very much appreciate you sharing a story that you've never shared before. And let me just ask you very simply, when you hear stories from women like this, as someone who has experienced what you just told us about, what are your thoughts? It's obvious what your thoughts are as a woman,
right,
and a mother, but as someone who understands this cause in a way that many people don't.
I think my first thought is there, but for the grace of God go I. And I think any parent hearing these horrible stories thinks that. And then how that is transferable to politics is a separate issue. But I think regardless of your political affiliation, you hear stories like this, and you hear these women who may be Republican, I don't know what their political affiliation is, but when they desperately want to be pregnant and desperately want to have a child and yet are told, I'm sorry, your fetus is not viable, but you have to carry it. You have to do what you have to do, regardless of what's best for you, what's best for your health, what's best for your reproductive health, what's best for you becoming a mother again, potentially. When you hear stories like that, I don't know how hard-hearted you have to be to not appreciate that, how radically ideological you have to be to say, carry that fetus, even if that fetus has no chance of survival, even if that fetus is not really alive inside you, you have to do this because we're ideologically committed to you carrying that fetus. And by the way, for the doctors who were trained to take care of these babies and to take care of these mothers and to take care of these pregnancies, to be told that you can't do what you've been trained to do to save the mother, even if the baby has no viable path to survival, what does that say to them? As doctors, as professionals, they're standing by. Their first job is to do no harm, except the state is telling them, you must do harm. You must do harm to your client. It's just unconscionable.
Mary, women who have been very brave enough to tell these stories to help people understand how broad this issue of reproductive rights really is, think about this issue in ways that, frankly, many people had never thought about it before, does also raise the question about where this goes legally. And I wonder about rights groups preparing for Trump's second term. Are lawyers on the reproductive rights side ready? And where do you see the battleground going next?
Well, I think a lot really depends on Trump in that regard, right? So we're in an unprecedented moment in the sense that Trump has both said he doesn't intend to use the power of the federal government to restrict abortion or ban abortion, and where there are a lot of options where he could use the power of the federal government to restrict or ban abortion or IVF or other things, even without Congress in some instances, in part because of strategies conservatives have laid out in Project 2025. So the first question is, what is he actually going to do? The short answer is that reproductive rights groups are prepared if he was not serious about abortion being a states' rights issue, with lawsuits, preemptive challenges, and the like. But I think we may have a kind of wait and see approach in the sense that Trump may not be putting the full weight of the federal government there immediately. A thing to watch, of course, is even if he's good for his word as far as using the federal government is concerned, he's going to be nominating judges who are going to be radically conservative on these issues, who will be taking lawsuits from conservative groups and running with them, as we saw last year with mifepristone. So the impact is going to be significant. Whether or not Trump wants his fingerprints all over a federal initiative limiting access to abortion and other reproductive services remains to be seen. But I think there is no question that there will be impacts going forward from the judiciary.